Are you man enough for a small watch? Hey, why did you just hit me?
Because them are fighting words.
It's just the theme of today's show.
Oh.
My brother's so rude.
Well, see ya.
Does anyone want a brother? Because you can have mine. He just messed up my intro, so we might as well get on with today's show.
I heard that.
Hi guys, I'm still recovering from being knocked out. So instead of the usual coffee intro, let's do a quick unboxing of a coffee. Cheers. And by the way, this is not my favorite blend. It's just okay. We must be really tight friends because this is a tight fit. Can't get this card out. Alright, there we go. And we are good friends. Ta-da! Coffee and sign here. So I thought we would have some fun talking about the return of the smaller size watches. Finally giving the smaller size watches for guys who really appreciate the classic size watches some terrific fanfare, or whatever you would want to call it. A big hurrah, because for a really long time we were celebrating the oversized watches, 44 mil and above. So it's really time to start celebrating and accepting the smaller size watches. And that's what today's show is going to be about. Whoa, I hope nobody punches me for that. Well, I actually didn't say, are you man enough? Today's show is inspired by a New York Times article titled, "Are You Man Enough for a Small Watch?"
You ready? Because I want you to pay attention. This is the beginning of something. Do you have time to improve your life? Do you have precisely 30 seconds for a word from Accutron watches?
Mad Men has been credited with sparking a revival in fedoras, tie bars, pocket squares, wingtips, and even old-fashioned heads, for those who may consider a cocktail a fashion accessory. But if there's one thing the show has whiffed on, it's watches. Even as Don Draper and Associates spent 7 seasons showing off their petite mid-century Omegas and Hamiltons, the prevailing trend had been toward hulking showpieces that could double as gauges on a submarine. Oddly, as Mad Men is in its final stretch, its horological influence may finally take hold. The jumbo watch fatigue is setting in. And what this means is the big watch movement is finally being phased out. And there are other watches from this article here. Like, for example, brands like Omega, Seiko, and Rolex are putting their weight behind neoclassic models built to human scale, each sending a message of cool mid-century elegance as crisp as a beef eater martini. So watches that are smaller than 40 millimeters were the watch sizes that were dominant at this year's Basel World. And some of the watches that were introduced as the smaller sizes are the Seiko. So to celebrate the 55th anniversary of the high-end Grand Seiko line, a vintage-looking 1967 62 GS automatic was introduced at 37.6 mil. Omega introduced us to the Globemaster at 39 mil, and Rolex introduced us to an Oyster Perpetual also at 39 mil. And at the more Bauhausy E end of the spectrum, George Jensen introduced us to a minimalist mechanical hand-wound small seconds hand model at 38 mil. As the big watches start to phase out, we might remember some of the obscene watches on that large end of the spectrum. We remember the U-Boat U-1942 with the massive 64.4 millimeters, which would easily swallow the 34 millimeter Cartier tank that was covered in the last show. So who do we credit for the big watches, and then who are we now crediting for the movement toward the smaller size watches? Well, we can thank Panerai for the really big watch movement, an Italian designed Swiss made watch. That really brought the influx of really large watches. But who do we think is responsible for the smaller size watches? Well, according to the article, they're crediting China. And we know that the Swiss watchmakers really were hit hard by the 2008 economic collapse. So they had to look for another country, look for something else to revive their brand. And they saw China. So I hate to generalize or stereotype, but the people in that country generally tend to have smaller size wrists. And the big watches really never caught on there. So the smaller, more sleeker, more elegant watches did. And now that all watch manufacturers were trending down towards the sizes, the classic size watches that we were all used to, and our fathers were used to, generations in the past were used to, the rest of the market really started to nod in approval and say that these sleek, sometimes what they referred to as a 39mm watch with no sub-dial and just 1 or 2 second hand just really looked gorgeous. So while we can thank Panerai for the really large watch movement, and I can actually say that it was a pretty exciting period for us. We haven't been introduced to such big watches, and for a whole decade, the 44mm and above are really dominant. But now we can also thank China for bringing watches back down to more realistic size. For those of us who are really ecstatic and happy for the revival of the more classic size watches, that's the country that we can now thank. When I say watches are coming down in size, I don't think that they're going to come down to 34mm and smaller. I think that's not realistic. I think the sweet spot is going to be between 36 to 39mm that we're now seeing, and 40 to 42mm for sports watches. I think that's a really nice sweet spot for sports watches. Do I think that the big watch movement is ever going to return? Yes, I do. Because like in fashion, everything old is new again. So everything is cyclical. If I don't say it slowly, I'm going to mess that up. Cyclical. I'm not saying they're going to come back for another 2, 3, 4 years, because they're just now being phased out. If the big watches come back, it's going to be maybe in another 12 to 15 years. And when they do come back, and they will come back in style, it's not going to be the gigantic 50 to 60mm anymore. Just like we're not going to go on the extreme sizes for the smaller watches. I think when the big watches make their return, it's going to be maybe between 44 to 46mm. IWC's been making that 46mm big pilot watch for a really long time now, and I think that'll be the cutoff when they do make their return. They're not going to exaggerate their sizes anymore. There's always going to be size shock when it comes to going from smaller to bigger watches and bigger to smaller. And I will say that I think it's a lot easier of an adjustment, a faster adjustment to go from a smaller watch to a bigger watch. I remember when the first time I put on a 44mm watch on my not very large wrist, my 6.5-inch wrist, and I thought, whoa, this is really large. But in a couple of minutes, our eyes really start to adjust and accept the larger size watches. It does take longer to go the other side from bigger to smaller, because when I started wearing my DJ36 after long periods of wearing 42mm and above, you know, it took long. It wasn't a couple minutes of an adjustment, but it was actually a couple of days before my eyes really started to adjust to the smaller size watches. But it does adapt. One of the other things that is kind of a pet peeve of mine is when someone says, oh, the watch is too small. There is no such thing as a watch being too small, because that literally means that it's too small to even put on our wrist. And the same thing for a watch is too big. There's no such thing as a watch that's too big. That would literally mean that the watch is too big to wear. So those are impossibilities. So actually, I kind of just prefer to say that a smaller watch is something that's on a smaller size, and a larger watch is an oversized watch, or a watch that's on a larger size. That's just one of my, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, quirks. Because your boy is crazy. And if we're one of the guys who really appreciates a big watch and can't see ourselves and refuse to wear one of the classic size watches, that's okay, good for us. But just remember this, the classic size watches never looked horrible on men much larger than us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you the next time. So whom can we thank for the bigger size watches? We can thank Panerai. And some of us might remember the Loveboat U-1942, U-Boat 19...